Henry Blackthorne. He's gone. 3 days passed. The coach boy's clipped words struck Clara Whitmore like a sentence handed down. She had crossed 1,000 miles carrying nothing but an old trunk and a single purpose: to accept marriage with Henry and rescue her family from ruin. But now that fragile hope lay shattered on the platform of Silver Creek. Ahead stretched the unforgiving West. Behind her loomed the weight of debt and the sting of pitying eyes. And before Clara could gather her breath, a figure stepped onto the porch of the Blackthorne house. Elias Monroe, the ranch foreman. He offered no comfort, no sympathy, only a blunt truth. The entire estate now belonged to Clara. The wind howled against the wooden sign, rattling it in sharp knocks, while the town's watchful gaze bore down. In that moment, Clara understood. Elias could be the anchor she desperately needed, or the harshest trial fate had just thrust into her hands. On an autumn morning in 1879, pale light fell across the locked leather trunk. Clara Whitmore laid her hand upon its roughened surface, as though steadying the pulse that beat too hard at her throat. The trunk was not large, its edges darkened, its cracked seams like the wrinkles on an old face. Inside lay a few dresses, some books, and a worn silver bracelet her mother had given her. All that remained after her family had slid into ruin. A whole life folded tight, bound within 4 corners of leather, as if lifting it meant carrying the entire weight of the past, a burden she could not set down. Silver Creek Station still dozed, but the early whistle of the train cut through the thin veil of mist. Her name was called in the long drawl of the West, strange upon the tongue, as though the Whitmore line so familiar in the East had suddenly turned into an echo without anchor. Clara answered only with a nod. She stepped down from the wooden platform, skirt snagging against the trunk, her eyes stung by the mix of coal smoke and dust in the air. The dirt road running past the station was dry and rutted deep with wagon wheels, like lines someone had carved on purpose. Autumn wind slid between crooked wooden buildings, rattling the saloon sign until it clapped against the wall. This place looked unlike any town she had known while traveling with her father. Silver Creek bore the marks of both haste and hardness: unfinished porches, roofs still patched, and faces that had grown stone firm from dust, wind, and the simple necessity of survival. When the wagon drew up close, the boy driver tipped back his knit cap, a stalk of straw between his teeth. His words were quick, snapping like a twig. Henry Blackthorne, gone. 3 days passed. Clara froze. Her knees wavered as though they might give way, her hand tightening on the leather strap. No cry tore free, no flood of tears, only the hollow sound of her heels striking out of rhythm on the platform boards, echoing in her ears like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Before leaving Connecticut, she had read Henry's letter over and over. The words were blunt, but carried the certainty of a man who knew his own mind. He wrote that he needed a wife, someone to share the white 2-story house he had raised out on the plains, a hand to keep the hearth fire burning, to keep the rooms from standing cold and empty. For Clara, 24 years old, already marked as a widow after a brief marriage, the letter had seemed like a rope thrown across a chasm. Her mother urged her to take it. Clara had nodded, and so her life was packed into a single trunk, her future into a promise inked in black upon paper. Now that promise had dissolved into emptiness. The man who was meant to be waiting on the porch was no more than a name spoken in the boy's flat tone. Henry Blackthorne was dead. A sudden death, 3 days past, leaving Clara with nothing but a destination turned uncertain. She set the trunk down upon the shul platform, exhaled a long breath that to her own ears sounded like a sob caught back. The wind whipped her skirt tight against her legs, and in that moment, Clara realized she stood between two worlds. Behind her, the rail that led eastward to debt and whispers of pity. Before her, Silver Creek, offering nothing but harshness and strangers. The boy flicked the reins, the wagon jolted forward and then stilled again, waiting for her choice. Clara lifted the trunk, stepped off the platform. The sound of her boots on the packed earth was slight, but inside her chest it struck like the slam of a closing door. The station crowd thinned. A few curious eyes lingered on the woman in a faded navy dress, hair pinned neat but dust-covered from the long road. No one drew close. No one offered words. In the West, it seemed, curiosity was a luxury, one that could cost survival. Clara drew her shawl tighter, climbed into the wagon. The boy spoke only 2 words. "Let's go." The wheels groaned across the dry ground, leaving winding ruts behind. The land unfolded, sparse grasslands, leafless scrub clinging to life. The far ridges painted purple under a gray-washed sky. The air carried the iron bite of cold wind mixed with the acrid scent of burnt grass. Clara held her hands tight upon her lap, eyes fixed ahead. The boy's words, "Gone," tolled in her mind like a bell refusing silence. She remembered the last night at her mother's house. The lamp flame wavered in the draft, while her mother gripped her hand hard, whispering, "Go, Clara. You deserve a place that might yet be hope." Hope. The word now felt like a bitter jest. But what choice had she? To remain in Connecticut, a dependent in a house heavy with creditors, swallowing pity and gossip? No. This road, though opened by death, was still the only road left. The wagon jolted over a pothole. Clara bit down on her lip to steady herself. Each jarring bump reminded her this was no dream. Henry Blackthorne was truly gone, and she, alone in the West, was left to claim a life she had never imagined. The wind grew harsher as the wagon turned the bend, raising a long plume of red dust behind them. Clara's eyes lifted to the sky. Black-winged crows wheeled in wide circles, dropping low before soaring again. Their flight called back her father's words. "Out here nothing greets you but trial, but if you stand firm, the whole sky will be yours." Clara swallowed hard, blinking back tears. Inside the trunk beside her, the folded dresses no longer seemed relics of an Eastern girl, but a fragile shell around a seed torn from its soil. And now that seed had been cast into this rough land. The road stretched ahead, fading into red dust and the silver light of late autumn. The wagon rolled on, carrying Clara toward another life, one she had not prepared for, but from which there was no return. The road to the Blackthorne Ranch stretched across hills where the grasses had faded to late autumn silver. Wild sage scattered in patches, its dull green merging with the brown of the earth, lending the land an air at once desolate and stubborn. Clara sat in the wagon with her trunk beside her, one hand resting on its lid, as though she needed something solid to balance the life that had just been shoved off its familiar rails. The house appeared beyond a thin stand of bare birches. It was not the sagging homestead she had imagined of the West, but a 2-story dwelling painted white, with a steep roof, a broad wraparound porch, and glass windows that caught the gray of the sky. Though time had marked it, the house carried a quiet gravity, imposing, solemn, heavy with stories Clara had never dreamed she might step into. When the wagon stopped, she stepped down, her skirt brushing the stair muddied by dried streaks of rain. A man stood waiting on the porch, his shoulders broad as the doorway behind him, his gray coat frayed at the seams, its hem stained by road dust. His face was sun-browned, his eyes a cold gray, flat as an ice-bound lake. He did not offer greeting or scrutiny, only dipped his head slightly. "Elias Monroe," he said, his voice rough, the sound of timber knocking. "Foreman of Blackthorn." Clara answered with the smallest nod, realizing that the courtesies drilled into her in the East meant little here. Elias lifted her trunk as though it weighed no more than a ledger and led the way inside. The parlor smelled of dry pine smoke from the hearth. Faded landscapes hung on the walls, their colors yellowed by years of soot. On a long table covered with coarse cloth lay neatly stacked papers, the seal on one envelope already broken. Clara lowered herself into a chair, her palms clammy, while Elias stood off to one side, arms crossed, his gaze never straying from the words spread across the table. The town lawyer, a thin old man with hair white as ash, unfolded the documents and began to read. His voice was slow, deliberate, each word dropping heavy in the air. It was Henry Blackthorn's will, signed only weeks before his passing. Clara shivered when she heard her own name spoken aloud, as though it had been plucked up and cast into a place it did not belong. The lawyer paused to clear his throat, then read on. And when the last word fell, the room felt hollow. The ranch, the land, the cattle, the house. All of it transferred to Clara Whitmore, a woman who had stepped down from a train with nothing but a trunk and hands that had never saddled a horse, was now the owner of a western estate. No applause, no congratulations, only the pop and crackle of the fire, as though mocking her disbelief. Clara's fingers dug into the fabric of her dress, her eyes fixed on Henry Blackthorn's signature, inked strong and steady on the final page. The hand did not look like that of a man preparing to die. She could not fathom why he had chosen her, over kin, over business partners, to bear the weight of his legacy. Elias stepped forward, setting a glass before her. His movements were deliberate, as though any misstep might shatter the silence of the house. "Water," he said, nothing more. Clara lifted the glass, her hand trembling. Her lips were so dry the water tasted metallic, sharp as iron. Her heart thudded, not with triumph, but with a weight half burden, half fear. And in that moment, Clara understood. The door that had opened before her was not escape. It was a threshold for which no one had prepared her. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the window panes. A horse neighed far off, its call carrying over the grasslands, a reminder that this land would not wait patiently for a novice mistress. The lawyer gathered the papers into his worn leather satchel. "Miss," he said slowly, "it is yours now. But for that very reason, the responsibility is yours as well." Clara nodded. She did not argue. She did not ask. Yet inside she felt like a piece moved onto a board of a game she had never learned to play. When he left, his frail figure vanished into the mist beyond, leaving the house to Clara and Elias. He stood still, stone-carved, gray-eyed, watching. There was no expression in him, but she felt the weight of caution, perhaps even of judgment. "You've never ridden a horse, have you?" Elias asked at last. His voice carried no scorn, but it pressed enough to make Clara bite her lip. She inclined her head. "This place is not just land and walls," he said. "It lives, it breathes, it demands, and it won't bow easily to a mistress who doesn't know how to hold the reins." Clara's hands tightened on the arm of the chair. His words were true, yet beneath the fear flickered something small, like the catch of a flame. Not confidence, but the thought that if Henry Blackthorne had trusted her, then perhaps, somewhere, the reason was waiting to be revealed. She rose, her back a little straighter. "I will learn," Clara said, her voice low but steady. Elias studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head as if granting temporary leave to a promise untested. And in that pine-scented room a new life began, shaped not by preparation, but by the sudden weight of inheritance neither of them had chosen. The bedroom given to Clara held a hand-stitched quilt, each square a patch of fabric worn from older days, colors uneven but warm. On a low wooden table, someone had hastily set a jar of wildflowers, their purple petals leaning toward the window where the late light still lingered. When the door closed behind her, Clara let her body fall against the wall, loosened her hold, and allowed the tears to come. Quiet, soundless. The grief struck her like a western wind, dry, sudden, unstoppable. That night, she lay still in the unfamiliar room, where warmth still clung from another's use. The wind slipped through the cracks of the shutters, timbers groaned under the porch, and an owl called across the field. All sounds woven into a kind of song Clara did not yet know how to hear. She turned in the bed, her eyes open against the dark, feeling herself a misplaced object in the wrong house. And yet, there was something gentle, almost merciful in the way the house did not reject her. It simply accepted her presence, whispering without words, "Here, you may rest." By morning, Clara woke in the thin wash of light, pale gold seeping through the curtain. As she stepped down the staircase, the scent of flour and butter greeted her. Mrs. Abernathy, a widowed woman from town, was kneading dough in the kitchen, her round face damp with a sheen of work. She set a plate of warm rolls upon the table and looked at Clara as though they were already kin. "Eat, child. The western wind can carry away the thin ones." Clara pressed her lips together, nodded, and lifted a roll. The crust broke crisp, the soft middle warmed her stomach, melting away a corner of her emptiness. With Mrs. Abernathy's presence, with the smell of bread fresh from the oven, the house seemed to know how to ease the ache Clara could not put to words. By noon she wandered to the stables. The horses lifted their heads to regard her, eyes steady but strange. She had never fastened a saddle, never held a rein. Her hand brushed a mane, coarse and unfamiliar. Elias appeared in the doorway, silent, watching. He gave a single nod, an acknowledgement that she was trying. No scorn, no offer of easy help. His silence was its own mercy, a space where she felt unjudged. That evening, Elias carried coffee to the porch. The bitter warmth drifted in the breeze, steam rising from a dented tin cup. He set one before Clara, then lowered himself into the wooden chair beside her. No questions, no need for answers. They both looked out across the dry fields, where wind tore through the railings, carrying red dust that streaked the sky. Between the two chairs, the distance was measured, not too close, not too far, enough to be safe, enough to keep either from feeling alone. Clara sat quietly, her eyes tracing the calloused lines of Elias's hands. She wondered why a man like him, stern, unbending, chose to spend an evening beside a stranger who had no place here. But then she realized there needn't be, reason. Some presences existed simply to prove that one's existence was recognized. On her second night in the house, Clara did not cry. The wind still keened, but she listened differently, like a heartbeat pulsing through the land itself. The thick walls did not shut the wind out, but they pushed it farther, turned it into something distant, unable to touch her. The wildflowers on the table drooped further, but when Clara changed their water, she felt she was preserving a fragment of life for herself. The next day, Mrs. Abernathy returned with a basket of fresh greens. She spoke of town gossip, of how folks still whispered about the sudden turn of the will. Clara stayed silent, only listening. Elias kept to his rhythm, appearing in the afternoons, sometimes with work papers, sometimes with nothing but coffee. Slowly, the house carved its own pattern. Morning filled with the scent of baking, noon marked by the sound of horses, evening by the hush of the porch, night by a lamplight flickering across the wooden table. Each small detail seemed to know how to comfort her. The quilt taught that scraps could be stitched into something warm. The wildflowers gave her the simple duty of refreshing their water each day, a reminder that life could be fragile yet persistent. The bedroom door closed behind her became a wall that kept out the weight of the world. The groan of the staircase as she climbed each night became a lullaby of its own. Clara came to see that sometimes a house need not speak. Its quiet endurance was enough. In that silence she found a solace people often failed to give. And there, on the porch in the breath of the western wind, with Elias's presence steady beside her and the house breathing its quiet warmth around her, an unspoken promise was born. She would not have to face this land alone. After supper, the kitchen still carried the scent of cornbread and wood smoke. Clara washed the dishes in a basin of warm water, listening to the wind slipping through the cracks as though the west itself were playing a slow, restless song. Elias quietly gathered the remaining plates, his hands, accustomed to rougher labors, awkward against the fragile china. When the table lay bare, he turned and placed something into Clara's hands. A bundle wrapped in old burlap, sun-scorched and frayed. It was a leather-bound journal, its edges curled from rain, its cover pocked with burn marks as if it had once been flung too near a fire. Elias offered no explanation, only a brief glance before stepping out onto the porch, leaving Clara alone with the keepsake. She set it upon the table, her hands trembling as she opened the first pages. The smell of damp paper rose up, laced with dust and sweat, a scent like memory that could not be denied. On the yellowed leaves, Henry's hand appeared, slanting, uneven, at times forceful as a hammer blow, at times hurried and wavering as though written by firelight. Day 3 drove the herd across the shallows, night cold, cattle shivering, but my fire kept man and beast alike. Day 5 saw a glimmer at the edge of the field, not tribesmen. Fire moved with a guide. Clara read slowly, each word heavy as if she were treading across a field strewn with jagged stones. Page after page told not only of cattle drives, but of watching eyes, of a life lived at the edge of a borderland where shadows lingered and danger stalked unseen. Midway through the book, the lines grew shorter, harsher, no longer about the herd or the weather, but cold fragments. Day 12, someone trailing, not ordinary folk. Day 13, gunfire north. No man in the crew dared speak. Day 15. Dark night. A figure appeared, vanished before I could name him. Clara's breath caught. Her hand clamped the edge of the book, as if letting go might scatter the words to the wind. And then, on the final page, her eyes fell upon a single line, bitter as a blade's cut. Not accident. Trust Monroe. Beware the authorities. No explanation, no farewell, just those words, leaving behind a chasm. The journal dropped from her hand to the table with a muted thud, but inside her it sounded like a crack of thunder. Henry, whom she had believed lost to some cattle-driving mishap, might have been murdered. A hidden bullet, a scheme in the dark, and a name rising out of the page like a shadow. Monroe. Beyond the window, the windmill turned slow, its creak indifferent, as though the world outside cared nothing for the warning that had thrust Clara to the brink. The ordinariness of it all made her shiver. This land was not gentle, and the truth lay buried deep in dust yet to be stirred. Elias returned carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He set one before her, then sat opposite without a word. He saw the glint of tears in her eyes, but let the silence stretch around them. It was not heavy silence, but a blanket, giving her space to fold away the storm inside. Clara drew a breath, laid her hand once more upon the journal. She did not reread, yet the words were carved deep already. In her mind, Henry rose not as a simple rancher waiting for a bride, but as a man who had stepped into the darker reaches of the frontier. His death was no longer simple, and in that moment, Clara understood. This house she had thought a refuge was now the threshold to a new reckoning. Outside, night swallowed the hills. The long howl of wolves braided with the wind, sounding like a summons from far away. Clara pressed her palm against the leather cover, as if to touch Henry one last time, and exhaled slowly. When she finally climbed to bed, she left the journal on the nightstand, a lantern of ink unextinguished. Each time the wind rattled the shutters, she started, her mind chasing the faceless figures Henry had called not ordinary, the shadowed name of Monroe, the hint of treachery in the government itself. What should have been anchor and order might in truth be the blade at her throat. Fear was no longer the cold gust outside. It was the knowledge that Henry's story held corners still in shadow. From this hour forward, her life would not remain enclosed by porch and hearth. A new door had opened, one leading into a country where truth and lies circled each other like flame and shadow. Before closing her eyes, Clara whispered in thought, "If Henry paid in blood, I will not let that death be buried." She drifted into a fitful sleep where every sound in the dark carried weight. On the nightstand, the old journal caught the lamp's glow, silent but heavy, a witness that would not forget. And the western night moved on, slow, uneasy, promising the stir of a new season in its restless wind. The days that followed unfolded like lessons written across the wide plains. Each morning felt like a classroom without walls, and Clara realized that to hold this house, to protect the 2 children, she would have to begin again. Learn everything, from the smallest chore to the hardest labor. She learned to read the ledgers, neat columns of numbers once alien to a woman more familiar with kitchen markets than livestock accounts. Elias sat beside her, slow in his explanations, showing her the notations Henry had always used. He never did the work for her. He only guided, then let her write. At first, her hand shook across the paper, but Clara pressed on until the pages slowly began to bear her own mark. She learned to ask after surplus prices, to weigh each pound of beef in her questions. Elias did the figures in his head, quick and sure, then had her speak them back in her own voice. The merchants in town looked surprised at first to hear the widow Whitmore bargaining, but soon they grew accustomed to her even, steady gaze. She learned to test the fences with her bare hands, ignoring the gloves Elias offered. "If I don't feel the thorns, I'll never truly know where they are," she told him. He only nodded. The scratches turned her palms raw, but over time they hardened. Proof that her hands, once only fit for smoothing a child's hair, were finding strength in barbed wire and wind. Under the noonday sun, Elias taught her knots. What looked simple demanded patience. Each loop, each pull had to be exact. The rope slipped often from her grasp, but Clara refused to give in. She bit down on failure, lips pressed tight, eyes glinting with stubbornness. Elias said nothing, but something in him eased at the sight. Evenings found Clara at the table beneath the window, reading Henry's old letters aloud. Her voice carried the same clipped rhythm as his pen, but hidden in the words lingered a far-off warmth. Elias listened quietly, never interrupting. To him, they were more than memories of a man gone. They were quiet lessons about the land, and about the woman now facing it with unshaken will. Between lessons, there were moments that slipped by unnamed. Her hand brushed against the thick callus of his palm while tying a rope. His gaze lingered a breath too long on her figure, lit by lamplight through the window. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the tug of an invisible cord stretching between them. Not tight, only enough to remind them that someone stood on the other side. On certain mornings, Clara carried water out to the garden, her skirt whipping in the wind. From a distance, Elias would watch, pausing in his stride. He saw a woman still carrying sorrow, yet choosing to answer it with work, not complaint. He did not interfere. Strength, he knew, had to be forged by one's own hands. But still, he was there. When Clara dropped a basket of carrots, he didn't stoop to gather them, only said, "Hold them lower next time. The wind won't snatch as easy." When she struggled with the rusted hammer, he didn't take it away, only steadied the nail so she could strike it true. Always one step back, letting her move forward, but near enough that if she stumbled, there would be a shoulder waiting. One evening, at supper, Lydia asked softly, "Why do you have to learn all this, Mama? We have Elias." Clara set down her spoon, her eyes steady on the child's innocent face. She smiled, though there was firmness in it. "Because if the day comes when Elias isn't here, we still have to stand. Remember, no one can lean forever on just one pair of hands." Elias heard, lifted his eyes, and met Clara's. Something flickered there, respect, and a quiet ache neither of them voiced. So the days rolled on. What was once only shelter against rain became a school, a proving ground, and a place where Clara began to reclaim herself. The ledgers no longer lay flat as lifeless numbers. They mapped survival. The knots she tied were more than rope and timber. They held together the bones of a home. And when the night wind pressed hard against the shutters, she no longer shrank back. She drew the quilt over her children and closed her eyes, knowing morning would still find her able to rise. She was learning to stand firm, not alone but no longer as one clinging helplessly to others. And in those lessons, something else was kindling. Not loud, not declared, but a warmth enough to change the house that had long known only the cold voice of the wind. That night, the dogs barked, sharp, relentless, as though they meant to rip apart the fragile stillness of the house. Clara jolted upright, heart pounding. Elias was quicker, seizing the oil lamp and motioning for her to follow. Its weak yellow flame stretched trembling shadows across the wooden walls. The wind outside shrieked through the cracks, carrying with it the bite of cold. There was no thief. On the porch stood a woman, draped in a black cloak powdered with road dust, her face hollow, but her eyes cutting, fierce as a blade. She needed no long preamble. Her voice rasped out clear, like a command. Abigail Blackthorne, Henry's sister. The name struck the floor heavy as an iron weight. Clara swayed where she stood. Elias tightened his grip on the lamp handle, the light casting hard lines across the woman's stern features. Abigail drew from her satchel a stack of papers, their edges thickened with the bulge of wax seals. She dropped them onto the table, the slap echoing dry and final in the cramped room. "This is a claim of inheritance," she said. "I've come to take back what belongs to my family." The air seemed to stiffen. Clara had never once considered that Henry's kin might come knocking. He had been silent about them, speaking only of a severed bond. Now that silence rose like a storm long building, Elias lifted the stack, flicked through the pages. Crimson seals glared back at him. The words were sharp as knives. Claim of rightful inheritance. Transfer of property. Lands belonging to the Blackthorne line. Clara's stomach clenched. Everything she and Elias had fought to hold, the fences, the seedlings, the ledgers she had just begun to master, suddenly threatened by a single stamp of red. Then Elias set the claim aside and drew another paper from the drawer. He turned it toward Clara. Henry's familiar hand, steady and strong, stretched across the final will, witnessed and sealed. The ranch, in whole, left to Clara Whitmore, with one line added in cold, unmistakable ink. "The only one I trust." Abigail's eyes flashed. She did not rage, did not strike. She only stared, long and piercing, as though to bore through Clara's composure. "You have papers," Clara said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "But he left his last word, and it stands with me." Silence fell, heavier than any gunshot. Abigail gave a small nod, turned on her heel. Her filthy boots thudded across the boards, leaving wet marks like scars on the floor. The black cloak disappeared into the night, the door slamming hard behind her. Only the smell of lamp smoke remained, and Clara's ragged breath. She sank into a chair, clutching the edge of the table as though she might slip from the world itself. Elias stood behind her, his hand settling on her shoulder, warm, steady. "It isn't finished," Clara whispered. Elias nodded once. "No, it's only begun." The next morning, Clara spread the will open and read every word. Ahot. Line affirmed her claim, but read also like a message Henry had left, knowing his kin might come. He had prepared for this. Clara sat in silence a long while. She understood now. Learning the ranch had been only the beginning. To hold the land was not just planting seed or tending cattle. It was standing firm against those who would wrest it away, even when they bore Henry's own blood. At dusk, Elias went out to check the fences. Clara gathered the papers, stacking them neatly in a wooden box. Her fingers paused over Abigail's wax seal. The red mark glared back, less an emblem than a threat. It told her that ink and parchment alone would not defend this place. She looked out the window. The windmill turned as always, indifferent to the danger that had just stalked through their door. The calm of the scene was almost cruel. But within her, a new resolve had hardened. She would not merely learn to manage, she would learn to protect, to ensure that no hand, not even a blackthorn hand, could erase what she had built. That evening, beneath the lamplight, Elias asked quietly, "Do you regret it, holding on to all of this?" Clara shook her head. "No. If I yielded now, Henry's rest would mean nothing. He chose me. I won't betray that." Elias said nothing more, only set a cup of hot tea before her. In the glow, Clara saw in his eyes not only worry, but trust. She was not alone. Yet she knew, too, this fight would demand that she stand on her own first. Outside, the wind gathered, sweeping dust into restless spirals. The little house stood solitary on the plain, but Clara no longer saw it as fragile. From the moment Abigail crossed the threshold, she understood. To keep a home required more than laboring hands. It demanded a heart like iron and the clarity to face every cold stare waiting in the dark. News that traders from Chicago were bound for Cheyenne swept across the Whitmore Ranch like a brisk new wind. It had always been Henry's duty each year, riding north to the high plains with ledgers, grain, and the family's reputation. Now that task fell to Clara. Elias said it plain, without accusation, only as fact. No one bargains in place of the owner. Clara nodded. The night before departure, she hardly slept. In the glow of the oil lamp, she folded her notes carefully, bound them with twine, as though preserving fragments of Henry himself. By morning, the sun had barely brushed the fields with bronze when Elias waited in the yard, reins firm in his hands. Clara drew her cloak tight, the chill slapping her awake. Their shadows stretched long across the prairie, wavering, then trailing far behind until the little wooden house was nothing but a dark speck. They rode the trail north, toward the mountains standing blue-black against the horizon like walls of sky. At the first line shack, rough timber for the road-worn, Clara wrestled with damp wood. Smoke stung her eyes, the fire refusing to catch. Her lips pressed thin, she wanted to prove she could manage, but her hands trembled against the cold. Elias said nothing, only knelt beside her, gathering what scraps of dryness remained, building a fragile flame and coaxing it with his breath until fire held steady. When it caught, the glow fell across Clara's face, showing pride mingled with gratitude. Supper was only beans and salted pork, yet the warmth of the pot over the fire filled the shack with comfort greater than its meager fare. That night, wind whistled through cracks in the walls. Two narrow beds faced one another, blankets too thin for the chill. Distance remained, but not estrangement. Clara lay still, listening to the wind blend with Elias's shifting weight, and for the first time in many months, she did not feel alone. The next day, the trail grew rough. Horses broke thin ice at stream crossings. Pines drew nightfall early with their shadows. Clara sat straight in the saddle but wavered now and then. Elias rode level, watching, hand quick to steady her reins when the slope cut too steep. He gave no speeches, only a single nod when she recovered. That nod, plain and certain, calmed her more than 100 reassurances. When they stopped by a stream, Clara unwrapped coarse rye bread, dry and tough, yet Elias accepted without complaint, eating slow, as if valuing both her clumsy effort and her intent. In the lowering light, his hair glinted a coppery shade. Clara almost spoke, then swallowed the words, letting only a faint cough escape. The glance they exchanged said enough. On the third day, they met a band of Cheyenne traders, wagons stacked high with pelts and wolf hides. wheels creaking across frozen ground. The leader greeted Elias with a nod, then studied Clara with a keen, measuring eye. For the first time, she felt herself tested as mistress of the land. Her pulse raced, but she held his gaze steady and unyielding. Elias did not step in, only watched, letting her stand on her own. When the wagons rolled on, he murmured, "Henry did the same." By dusk, they reached Cheyenne, sky aflame red along the rim. The frontier city clattered with wheels, horse cries, and shouts from saloon doors. Oil lamps lined the streets, gilding weathered signs with yellow light. Clara tightened her grip on the reins, a little daunted. Elias rode close, his voice low but certain. "We're here." That night they took a room above a noisy tavern. Laughter and clatter rose from below, but in their upstairs chamber only quiet breathing remained. Clara sat by the window, watching lanterns glimmer over the street. Elias set the ledger on the table. "Tomorrow will be long," he said. She nodded, and silence settled. No longer distance, but shared space. At dawn, the bargaining began. Clara stepped into the merchant's hall with her hands still trembling, but her eyes firm. Before her sat thick-coated men with voices rough and curt. Elias stood behind, silent as a wall. Clara opened the ledger, laying out grain tallies, supplies, and measures as Henry once had. When one trader tried to cut her low, smiling thin, she stopped, drew a breath, and named a truer figure in a voice clear enough to halt the room for a beat. Elias dipped his head slightly, the edge of a smile touching his mouth. When the dealings were done and contracts signed, Clara pressed the pen without a tremor. The papers were folded, sealed red with wax. Outside, snow began to fall in scattered flakes. Clara stepped to the porch, drawing in a long breath. Elias came behind, his hand brushing lightly against her back, not to guide her, but to affirm she had stood on her own. On the road home, the plains lay white, horses slogging through soft snow, hooves muffled to steady thuds. Clara looked ahead into the mist, knowing something within her had shifted. She had learned more than knots, fires, or ledgers. She had learned to stand before men and not bow. Henry had left her the land. Elias had lent her faith. But it was Clara Whitmore herself who had given her the strength to endure. On their last night out, again in a line shack, the fire glowed against rough walls. Supper was the same beans and pork. But when Elias placed the bowl before her, their eyes met differently now. The two narrow beds still stood apart, yet the space between was no longer empty. It had become a quiet bridge waiting for the day it might be crossed. On the third day of the journey, the sky pressed low and heavy, a gray blanket smothering the plains. At dawn, the snow came thin as chalk dust, but by noon it whipped down in sheets, fierce and urgent. Clara pulled her cloak tight, the wind striking her face like a lash. Elias rode ahead, back straight as a shield, but she knew he too strained to keep his horse steady. When the gusts turned merciless, they veered into an old line shack crouched against a hillside, a shelter once meant for herdsmen in the far seasons. The door sagged on its hinges, the room within dim and bitter cold. Frozen drips hung from the rafters, the air sour with damp and old ash. Elias tied the horses, then bent to split wood for a fire. The wet logs smoked, choking Clara until she coughed hard. He uttered no complaint, only knelt close, coaxing a stubborn flame with patient breath, until at last it caught and grew. Firelight lifted across his face, and Clara noticed, perhaps for the first time, the faint scar that ran from jaw to throat. a line etched by steel and time. They supped on beans and salt pork, food carried from the ranch. Outside, the wind howled as if it would strip the shack apart. Inside, the fire cracked, warmth seeping slowly into their bones. Clara huddled close, her eyes fixed on the scar. She did not ask. Elias sat long in silence, as if weighing something buried too deep. Then his voice came, low and hoarse. Words dragged like iron from under ice. He spoke of the war's end, how afterward he had been a man unmoored, drifting without kin or claim. Of the company he had kept, the wrong paths he had taken, and the deeds the law answered only one way, with a rope. He told her how close he had come, how he had looked at that noose swinging, knowing it waited for his neck. In that moment, a man might either shatter for good or surrender his name in order to live. Elias admitted he had nearly yielded. Then he lifted his gaze to the fire, his dark blue eyes unflinching. And he confessed the truth, the one he had carried quiet for years. It was Henry, her Henry, who had pulled him back. Henry had given him a place to work, a place to stand without running, even a name Elias could speak without shame. "I never betrayed what I promised him," Elias said softly. The words meant as much for himself as for her. Clara sat still, firelight warming her face, though inside she felt a swell of conflicting tides, gratitude for Henry, sorrow for Elias. In the white roar of the storm outside, that confession felt like the only thing real. The silence that followed was taut, filled with the thrum of their hearts and the relentless beat of wind against the boards. At some point, the invisible distance between them thinned. When Elias lifted his eyes, hers met his, and Clara found herself leaning forward. It was not calculation nor weakness. It was a cord stretched too long finally giving way. Their lips touched, tentative, trembling, each knowing that once the line was crossed, there was no return. But Elias was the one to draw back. His hand pressed gently to her shoulder before he stepped away, settling down upon the blanket spread across the floor. He pulled it over himself, eyes turned aside. "Some lines have to hold," he murmured, his voice both stern and sorrowed. Clara turned to the wall, her heart hammering so loud she feared he might hear it. In the dark, only the wind keened through the cracks and the blood in her chest slowed beat by heavy beat. That night stretched endless. Clara lay sleepless, haunted by faces of the past. Henry's gentle smile, Henry's hand resting on Elias's shoulder in the memory Elias had given her. She thought of her years spent guarding hearth, cattle, the Whitmore name from collapse. Now beside her was a man who owed his life to her husband, yet who made her feel less alone than she had in years. That, she realized, was the most dangerous thing of all. By morning, sunlight pierced the shack's narrow gaps, striping gold across the dirt floor. Elias rose first, stirring the fire with practiced ease, as if busyness could bridge the gulf of the night before. Clara stepped outside into a world scrubbed clean, white and silent under snow. The wind had stilled, but within her, another storm yet lingered. They set out again, hooves muffled in the powder, but Clara knew she no longer rode beside a mere foreman. She rode with a man bound by a heavy promise. And in her own silence, she admitted a truth to herself. She too carried a promise now, one to her own heart, that sooner or later, when the lines of duty and desire could no longer both be held, she would have to choose. Cheyenne roared, then passed like a storm of coal dust, leaving behind the smell of smoke and the echo of boots on wooden walks. Clara had signed her name to contracts in front of men with stiff collars and clipped beards, under whispers that could not quite hide their disbelief. An Eastern woman, someone they might have expected only as a flower in a parlor, had set her hand to papers heavy as mountains. They laughed into their whiskey, but none met her eyes. Clara understood. From that moment, she was no longer outside the tale. On the ride home, snow draped the land in a clean white sheet across the horses' backs. Steam from their breath mingled with the bite of wind. Elias rode silent, shoulders stooped as if he bore the storm that still lingered in the city. Clara clutched her cloak tight, feeling the cold arrowing down her collar. Each mile pulled them farther from Cheyenne, yet nearer to Silver Creek, where rumor outran any horse. And indeed, by the time the wagon crossed the town marker, the eyes were waiting. The tin-roofed saloon, the clapboard church, the rows of shops, all had windows, all had watchers. No words, no greetings, just stares. The women's glances were sharp, measuring, suspicious. The men's carried challenge, a flick of curiosity. In the whistle of wind through hanging lines, Clara heard the unspoken murmur. The bride from the east had become the mistress. At the ranch house, dusk scratched its claws along the porch. Elias spread the boundary map upon the table, oil lamp casting light over his scarred hands. Clara stood beside him, tracing the red lines that sprawled like veins across the paper. Boundaries were not only marks on parchment, they were fate itself. Elias pointed to a bend in Silver Creek, where the water curved like a scar. His voice slowed, careful with each word. That's where Judge Douglas has his eye. The hands speak his name often. Douglas, a name she had never seen in flesh, yet already knew by shadow. Shopkeepers mentioned him. Bartenders laughed over him. Whispers tied debts to him. They said he held half the town's ledgers in his pocket, and none dared pay him late. They said he smiled when he spoke of law, but the smile never reached his eyes. Clara looked at Elias. In the lamp's dim glow, the scar along his jaw showed sharp, as if to remind them that old battles never let go. He said nothing more, only circled the patch of land Douglas sought. A small ring on paper, but outside it was water, pasture, the very breath of their future. That night, Clara crossed the hallway and saw the ranch hands gathered near the stable. They hushed when she passed, lowered their heads, but hesitation glimmered in their eyes. The news had seeped everywhere, into meals, into teacups. The Eastern bride carried not just lace and a strange voice, but the authority of a pen stroke. To them, that was hope and danger. Later in her room, Clara loosed the pins from her hair. Wind pressed at the shutters, calling like a voice she could not answer. She studied her face in the dull mirror, wondering if it was hard enough, sharp enough, to stand against Douglas, or against a town waiting for her to stumble. Every choice now carried not only her name, but Elias's as well. The thought sent her pulse quick, a mix of fear and the heavy weight of responsibility. The next day they rode through Silver Creek. The saloon doors swung early, men crowding in with their laughter. Douglas did not appear, but his shadow clung to every chuckle, every clink of glass. One drunk leaned too close, looked Clara over and jeered, "Pretty, but paper won't keep long." Elias's hand touched lightly at her back, urging her on. He spoke no word, yet the touch alone was a vow. He would stand before her when the storm came, Days later, the ranch hands brought word. Douglas had summoned the landholders to meet, to speak of order and fairness. Everyone knew it was no invitation. Clara's hands froze over folded linens, the soft fabric suddenly heavy as iron. That night in the parlor, Elias laid the map out again. He won't strike plain. He'll smile. He'll speak of law. But it's all about the debt. Clara listened, the fire snapping in the hearth. She remembered the nights back east when her father signed away their house with a banker's polite grin. That memory, joined with Elias's gaze, steeled something within her. "Then we don't let ourselves owe him," Clara said, voice low but certain. Elias nodded once, shadows deep in his eyes. Outside, the wind swept new snow across the fields. Silver Creek slept, but the town's shadow lay stretched across their roof, long, sharp, and without end. Clara opened the safe. A chill of iron wafted out, biting at her nose. The square box sat deep within the timber recess, the very place Henry had kept under lock. Now the key lay in her hand, yet the act felt like prying open a door no one was certain should be crossed. Among the familiar deeds and boundary papers lay another ledger. Its cover was thicker, corners worn, the top edge marked with a pencil slash. Henry's habit, when he meant to bear witness himself. Clara drew it out. On the first page, his hand was plain, decisive. And then, lined across the paper, stood numbers, precise, unwavering, and written in red as though drops of blood had stained the sheet. The red inked numbers. Elias stepped close, his breath light on her shoulder. He said nothing, only looked. A book of debts. Yet beside each sum was a word. Settled, cleared, account closed. Page after page repeated the same verdict. Henry had erased them all. No debt remained. The field of his accounts lay clean as a harvested meadow, nothing left but stubble. Clara bit her lip, flipping faster. With each entry, her chest sank heavier. If this ledger was truth, then the bills delivered in Douglas's name, the notices nailed at doors, the threats whispered in town, were smoke, nothing more. She lifted her eyes. Elias gripped the table's edge, knuckles white. He spoke no word, but his gaze was ash cold. "Then," Clara whispered, "all the papers outside. Where do they come from?" Wind hissed through the seams, candle flames wavered, as though the house itself had heard. Elias moved away, circling the room, his steps weighted like stone. He was a man of few words, but now each motion was an answer unspoken. At last he stopped at the window. Beyond lay a world white with snow, as clean as the ledger's final page. "Douglas," he muttered, the name again. Spoken at supper by the hands, muttered in market stalls, smiling too smoothly in talk of law. Now it pressed over the red numbers like a stain that could not be washed. Neither of them spoke of fleeing. That thought was never given breath. To leave would mean abandoning this soil, the cattle waiting out the winter, the fences Henry's sweat had set in place. To flee was to let his memory rot. No, running was no answer. "Christmas is near," Clara said. Her voice was steady, low. Fair church, lanterns, all gathered in one place. If truth must be spoken, it has to be spoken where all will hear. Elias turned. Firelight carved shadows into his scar, deep as an old wound. He looked at her long, then nodded once. The next day, Clara worked as though nothing had changed. She rolled dough, hung clothes on the wooden line, wiped the long table with a damp rag. Yet each task carried another weight. Hold steady, keep rhythm, wait for the day to speak. Elias labored the fields, mending a broken gate, stacking cordwood high at the porch. Each time he returned, snow and mud clinging to his cuffs, his aptasupon. Eyes were darker, as if charting every mile of the road ahead. At night they sat again at the long table. Henry's ledger lay between them like a witness. Clara tapped lightly on the cleared lines, her finger firm. Elias traced the boundary map, marking the parcels Douglas sought. Each mark matched accounts already paid. Paper and fact stood against one another, irreconcilable. Clara remembered Cheyenne, the murmur when she signed, the way their collars stiffened. Their shock had not been that a woman wrote her name, but that her name carried weight. Now once again she would stake her claim, not on parchment, but in words cast before a crowd. The rumor had already raced ahead. By the time they reached Silver Creek, the looks no longer held only curiosity, but challenge. "The Eastern bride is the mistress now," they whispered. But beneath it was the question. What would the mistress do when Douglas spoke of law? Christmas drew near. The fair stretched down the main street, stalls bright with ribbons, dried fruit, wool from the east. Children skated and shrieked in the snow. Men carried casks and pine. Women lit lanterns in windows. The air was thick with spruce resin and whiskey. Clara and Elias walked among them like any pair. Yet inside their steps carried a gravity the others could not see. Each pace toward the church square was a step closer to unveiling the truth. Faces gathered, seamstress lifting her eyes from a bolt of cloth, the young pastor by his bell tower, the saloon regulars leaning from the doorway. They would be the ears, the tongues, the spreaders of news. Lanterns burned gold along the snowy street. Carols rang from the church. Bells chimed sharp. Clara's palms sweated cold. Elias's shoulder blocked the wind, steady as stone. "Now," he said, quiet. Clara stepped onto the wooden church stoop. The hum of the fair dimmed, voices stilled, as though every soul felt the weight of what was coming. She laid Henry's ledger on the pulpit, open to the page marked in red. Her voice carried, firm and dry though her throat ached. "Henry paid in full. Every debt is settled. The papers outside are not his." A murmur swept the crowd. Then a silence so stark she could hear her heart thudding. Behind her, Elias stood fast, his gaze a pillar. The name Douglas would surely follow, whispered before the night was done. But this evening, under the Christmas lanterns, the first truth had been spoken where all could hear. That Christmas Eve, Silver Creek wore its rare garment of cheer. The main road had been scraped clean of snow. Wreaths of deep green hung with red berries fastened to each doorway. Shop fronts burned more lamps than usual, as though defying the long winter. At the small wooden church, the echo of hymns still lingered, but the townsfolk had drifted instead to the hall, where the common feast was laid. The wheeze of a harmonica rose through the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread. Folks toasted and laughed, enough to fill the air, not enough to turn to chaos. Children darted between skirts and boots, fists clutching candy canes, red scarves bright as cardinals. Along the walls, candles glowed in glass cups, their tremor casting snow-like shadows upon the boards. Clara stood in a corner, fingers brushing the table's edge, chest taut as though a string wound too tight. She knew the moment had come. The red-inked numbers from Henry's ledger were etched in her mind. Clean, plain, indisputable. To remain silent meant the old rhythm would continue. Unseen debts gnawing away at every family, every acre. Elias passed by, pressed a tin cup of warm corn whiskey into her hand. His eyes did not hurry her. They were a quiet lantern in the dark. Clara raised her gaze to the pine tree in the hall's center, garland twined round, strands of copper wire catching light. At its peak burned not a star, but a fat candle set firm in dripping wax. She thought, perhaps truth should be lit here, among those who breathed the same dust day after day. When the music ceased, Clara asked for a word. Her voice carried beneath the pine boughs, not loud, but sharp enough that every head turned. At first it felt like politeness, as if she might offer thanks. But each sentence shifted the air. She told it plain. That a promise had carried her from the east, that Henry's sudden death left not only house and pasture, but shadows of debt. She told how in the safe the official pages spoke clear. Every account had been settled, neat as a field after harvest. And then she asked, if so, whence came the papers still arriving, stamped and heavy at every door? No accusations, no fury. Only the numbers, laid bare for silence to finish. Eyes turned one by one to the same corner. Judge Douglas sat there, velvet coat and snowy collar, wineglass in hand. He smiled, that same smile he wore when quoting law from the bench. Yet his grip on the stem faltered, a tremor betraying the practiced mask. Murmurs broke. Men muttered their names, recalling letters stiff with ink, signatures all alike. A blacksmith remembered paying in full last fall, only to be told otherwise. The seamstress spoke of threats despite receipts. Disjointed voices began to braid, a current swelling toward one point. Clara's heart hammered, but her hand held steady. Behind her, Elias stood, a wall of silence. He spoke nothing, did nothing, except what he always did best. Make certain she was not alone. Douglas set his glass down. The knock of crystal on wood echoed harsh. He forced a laugh. Tonight is for joy, not arithmetic. None joined him. Smiles had thinned to stone faces. The smith rose, soot still on his sleeves, saying he had proof of payment. The seamstress added hers. Others followed piece by piece until the hall brimmed with testimony. When one man held up a letter bearing Douglas's hand beside Henry's clean ledger, the crowd broke into a collective gasp. Clara stepped back, drawing breath deep. No verdict was needed. Truth had stepped forth of its own, candle on the pine, trembling but bright enough to show all. In that instant, Elias's hand touched her back. Light, firm. No words, only eyes steady as the evergreens, reminding her they had done right. Outside, wind slashed along the clappered walls. But within, people whispered, questioned, clasped hands as though reclaiming a faith lost too long. That Christmas was not only song and sweet bread. It was the night Silver Creek saw another flame lit, the flame of truth. And from that night on, one man's shadow began to shorten, no longer draping the whole valley. After Christmas, the false seals were exposed. Abigail held her tongue, then slipped from town with a valise lighter than her pride. None walked her to the edge. The whispers followed her footprints into the snowfields, only to fade as the wind erased her trail. Judge Douglas, after that night, showed himself little. Folks said he locked the door behind him, and the papers and stamps, once quick in his hand, now lay in the town council's keeping, waiting to be read line by line. Clara felt no triumph, no spite. Truth needs no verdict. It stands on its own weight. Winter ebbed slow, like a candle burning to stub. Snow lay heavy on the roof, muffling all traces of wrong. When the wind turned, warmth returned in thin trickles, water running down the slopes, gurgling like whispers of a new season. Above, the gray sky split open, yielding to deep blue. Young birches gleamed with sap, reaching as if to prove life had never left. In those days, Clara worked more than she spoke. She swept the plank floors, mended the broken latch, hung curtains she'd patched together from scraps. Elias, wordless as ever, was a wall she could lean against. Mornings he led horses into the field, reset a fallen post. Afternoons he sawed logs, raised a pen for stock. In that steady rhythm, two lives once far apart learned to bind, not through oaths or rings, but through sweat shared and breath drawn after long toil. One morning the Reverend came with townsfolk, carrying a wreath of pine twined by hand, something saved for solemn days. Beneath that arch, planted on the first green shoots, Clara and Elias stood side by side. No velvet coats, no gold bands. Their promise was simple as silence. To labor, to guard, to speak when needed, to keep still when not. No host of witnesses was required, for the land and the sky were witness enough. When the Reverend's prayer ended, there was soft applause. Then the gathering drifted like water to its many channels. Hoofbeats faded, leaving only two figures in young sunlight. Elias tilted his head, voice husky as timber scraping timber. "Home?" Clara looked toward the porch, the rocker creaking with the wind, sun scattering gold dust across worn boards. Her answer was soft as that light. Home. It was no grand hall, no empire of herds, yet in their eyes it was root and refuge, a hearth for weary steps. The days that followed filled with quiet patterns. Clara woke early, kindled the stove, let the scent of bread seep through the rooms. Elias hung his harmonica on the wall, now and then sending stray notes into dusk. They spoke little, understood much. Their silence was not void, but tether, binding two souls that had weathered loss. Once Clara stepped onto the porch, watching the prairie drown in scarlet sunset. She thought of lonelier days, standing by firelight, unsure if she'd have a roof tomorrow. Now, glancing sideways, she saw Elias lay another log to flame, and she knew she would not stand alone again. In the West, oftentimes nothing grand occurred. No gunfire, no roaring battles, no thunderous vows. Yet from a nod, from a shared resolve, life bent a different way. Clara came to see spring was not only snow melting, but fear retreating, truth enduring, and a hand that held without letting go. That was spring, and this house, at last, was called by name. When the door of that season closed, the tale of Clara and Elias left behind a hush, warm as an ember. No sweeping turns, no clashing wars, only endurance, honesty, and the creak of a porch swing in prairie wind. In this hurried age, the picture reminds us happiness is not always a grand design, but two souls choosing to stand and to build together. You, who have weathered many storms, may know that truth best. Love, real love, is not found in ornamented words, but in simple nods, in steadfast hands entwined. If this story has stirred an old memory or hushed your heart for a moment, leave a word below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so that others may hear these Wild West love stories, human, warm, enduring. Perhaps in memory and in sharing, we all might find our own home again within the heart.